Beyond Freedom, What? A program from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. This is one in a series of programs recorded during a conference held at the center to discuss with Professor B.F. Skinner the theories developed in his recent best-selling book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. In this program, 3 conference participants pressed Dr. Skinner for the answer to some basic problems they see in the proposal to apply operant conditioning on a broad scale. Michael Novak, professor of theology at State University of New York in Old Westbury, begins the dialogue.
The difficulty I've felt throughout the discussion is related in part to a professional matter with me. That is, the form of the argument necessarily is more theological, if I may use that word, than one might expect. And I think that's for a very clear reason. We argue in many cases here not so much about a theory as about a worldview attached to it. Now, the difficulty with arguments about worldviews is that from the point of view of those who hold one, because it is a worldview, there is an answer within the system to virtually everything. And from those who are not yet in it, there are sources of unease, but the logic and the arguments they're familiar with just don't apply in the other worldview. Therefore, I think we keep working around the edges, and I've been trying to find something around the edges to dramatize some sources of unease I have. I do feel that one can go quite a long way, plausibly, in interpreting mentalistic language and behavioristic language and so on, but I do want to express some of my uneasiness. Part of it has to do with the view of what the specific problem in our environment is. And I was reading recently a section that I had overlooked before in John Stuart Mill's Essays on Freedom, in which he remarks how much more alike Englishmen of his day are than 30 years before. And he's terribly worried about the increasing homogenization of English life. Now, if it is indeed homogenizing that is our problem, or one of our problems, then one would expect perhaps an environmentalist argument about the present circumstance to be on the side, maybe, of resistance. That is, one might have thought that the argument from a behavioral point of view would be to encourage all those movements in our society which resist the advances of certain kinds of technology, which try to keep things on low levels, which try to teach people to be happier with more kinds of pains. That to seek a painless state only involves us in incomparably worse problems. In our present environment, it seems plain that whatever controls there are, and there are plenty of them already, are more likely to be used by non-benevolent controllers than by benevolent ones. That is, the probability seems to be very high, as things presently are, that instruments of control increasingly follow the lines of present power and concentrations of power. And I find that politically terribly worrisome. Now, one reason...
May I interrupt? I do too, but what are you proposing? That we sequester the knowledge of behavior requirement?
No, I'm just proposing that if the argument from the point of view of the behaviorist, environmentalist, we're stressing, as I feel so far it doesn't very much, the developing of centers of resistance, of people resisting various kinds of organizations which are enormously counterproductive. Perhaps, for example, the automobile. That is, it could seem to be at times an anti-technological argument of certain sorts.
Well, yes, if you take the speed of airplanes as an example, and we decided not to build the SST, but we stopped progress. We're not going to go any faster. But I would say that's great progress, socially. Well, we would just simply say we're going fast enough. Let's not go any faster.
I want to make...
do you think that's stopping progress?
No, I just think that as the argument is stated in the book, the signs seem to point in the other direction. That is, it seems to be very often an appeal to an advance which we can't resist. There will be increasing restrictions on our freedom in the future, and how can it be made more palatable? I think that's a very good way of pointing.
I would argue with you about increasing restrictions. I think there will be some kinds of restrictions, but from them we will gain a much greater freedom.
This brings me to one last point, which bears on this point. In the argument against the autonomy or against the literature of freedom and dignity, there are two senses of the word autonomy which conflict here. I want to talk about very briefly. One is you can imagine autonomy in Kant's sense, a very high kind of autonomy, in which the very overcoming of difficulties and aversive stimuli is kind of proof of the kind of autonomy there is. But there's another one which has gained great currency, and I would say is much favored in our present environment. It's a highly privatized kind of autonomy, a highly private kind of do your thing, feel what you feel, be spontaneous at the moment, and it is very, I think, in the long run here, antisocial. And I think it's the constant emergence of the division in our lives between a private state, our weekends and other things, in which we may pursue our own pleasures, and the increasing sense of very felt controls because in such large systems in our public life that makes very powerful and very plausible the attack you make on autonomy. The social supports, the environmental supports of the kind of autonomy that John Stuart Mill talked plausibly about, we no longer feel. And therefore the theory of autonomy he talked about is increasingly weakened. But I am trying to express an unease about the form of your argument, which seems to me to weaken in all respects the possibilities of the development of individuality, of dissent, of fresh thinking, and so forth. I know that it is your intention to support those things.
I think it maximizes individuality. May I just make one comment?
Yes.
In something like the 14th century, I'm not sure of the dates, China was quite on a par with what we call Western civilization with respect to science and technology. In fact, she made the three great contributions of the era: movable type, the compass, and gunpowder. But she couldn't use any one of those. You were not allowed to make long voyages, so the compass didn't mean anything. The army was ritualistic, geomantic, and they used gunpowder and firecrackers. And the Chinese language did not improve because of the use of movable type. You had to have too many typefaces. Meanwhile, the West took those three things over, and in 300 or 400 years, it had conquered the world. Now, you may not like what it did. It used gunpowder and the compass to dominate the world. We wouldn't be here today if they hadn't done it, but we may still say, let's stick with the Chinese. But the point I'm raising right now is whether or not we now have something comparable to gunpowder, the compass, a movable type, and we're not going to be allowed to use it because we're geomantic, because we are ritualistic, because there are bounds beyond which we're not allowed to sail.
The next question is posed by Fred Warner Neal, Professor of International Relations at Claremont Graduate School. Professor Neal is asking about the social responsibility that should be felt by a social scientist who proposes to institute conditioning on a large scale. Should he feel more or less responsible, for example, than did the atomic scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project?
Your atomic theorist, your nuclear theorist, has certainly got to be concerned with not only E equals mc squared, but how this relates to certain combinations of atoms.
Yes.
Would it follow, therefore, that the social scientist must not only be concerned with a certain theory, but with a certain relationships and certain results, which he may be for, he may be against, but I'm wondering if he doesn't have to be concerned with them in order to be really a complete social theorist.
I don't believe he has to be concerned in order to be an effective social scientist, but all of these people will be called in when social problems arise. The nuclear scientist and disposing of waste from nuclear power plants, the biologist and dealing with immunology and whatnot, and these become very, very great importance to everyone. The social scientist who could, so far as I can see, deal entirely with the relationships he is investigating in his subject matter, could, but need not, be concerned with the bearing of this on the future of the human condition.
Well, then let me follow that up by asking you about the difference, if one existed, between a culture and a society. And I gather they are approximately the same in your mind.
What evolves when cultures evolve are practices, just as what evolves when the species evolve are traits. And two cultures can have the same trait or for something very much like it. They remain different if there's no communication through genetic transmission between them. Two cultures can have the same practices, but there will be no contact between them if they're isolated. I do not think of a culture as any monolithic thing which is growing as a state is. A state is held together by boundaries and whatnot.
Is there a separate America, and that is to say United States culture?
Well, I can't imagine that anyone would want to suggest that. We talk about the American way of life, but it must be very different from anyone who ever thinks about it, what he sees in front of him when he sees the American...
Western culture, then.
Well, Western culture is a bigger package, but again, I'm not talking about the evolution of a thing called the American way of life or a Western culture, but the American way of life contains thousands of practices in education, industry, government, family life, everything you can think of. Each one of those relatively independent of the others. Some of them are held together pretty much because they're under common environmental control. But the things which go on evolving are practices. And if you could imagine that with eventually one world culture, evolution would still go on. Better practices would still arise and displace less effective practices.
But since we're talking about culture designing,
yes,
doesn't this mean that the culture designer must operate within a particular society, or do you think of him as theoretically at least operating on a global basis?
No, I think he works in a society. I don't think he designs a whole society.
You talked about gradual behavioralism and distinguished yourself,
yes,
your own ideas, for example, from that of the Marxists, whom you said believe in doing things in one package. And on the other hand, in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, you say here are these things, a life in which people will be happier and better, which you can do,
yes,
which can be achieved if we will apply the theory of operant behavior. Well, now, one of the things that bothers me is how you can say we can do it when you have to operate in a gradual process during which the old contingencies are going to remain effective, with great influence, with great force, with great control, up to some certain point.
Yes, and that's why the other possibilities are other possibilities are attractive. You either escape from this society and start an entire one of your own. That's the utopian line, or you reform the present society and start it all over again on some new lines. But I think that what I said in that passage is simply a reference to the kinds of separate things that can be done as things now stand. I really believe, may I just find that's the very last business here, it is hard to imagine a world in which people will live together without quarreling. Now, we've done a good deal in family counseling, the handling of children and so on, which move in that direction. I don't mean to say that we're not going to have a lot of quarreling still. Maintain themselves by producing the food, shelter, and clothing they need. We have an industrial system that does that now, too well in this country, not well enough in other parts of the world. But that can be moderated so that it actually enjoy themselves and contribute to the enjoyment of others in art, music, literature, and games. That refers to my problem about leisure. I think that we are not doing very much to encourage people to engage in leisure time practices, which are actually of value to them or the culture. Consume only a reasonable part of the resources of the world and add as little as possible to pollution. Those are issues which are now actively underway. We're still stuck with a lot of problems, but that's the kind of thing. Bear no more children. Well, I won't go on with that. These are things that can be done in any culture.
But this comes back to my earlier question of national cultures. One of the things which you cited in the beginning as being a threat to cultural survival was thermonuclear war. Yeah. Now, thermonuclear war results, in part at least, from the existence of separate and competing national cultures, each of which perceive an aggressive intent on the part of the other. Now, supposing that inside of a national culture you could, by a cultural designing, by operant behavior, do away with aggressiveness of intention, you still, if you have separate national cultures competing, are going to have a very great problem in perception by one of the other, which is actually the essence of the threat in which we find ourselves now. My own feeling is that neither the Americans nor the Russians, for example, actually are aggressive in a force-using sense against the other, so far as intentions go. But both quite honestly perceive it. Right. Now, supposing you could do away with aggressive intentions within each of the national societies, would you still have the same problem of perception?
Well, you put it in terms of perception, which throws me off again. Actually,
you pick your own term. You know what I mean.
No, I don't think I do know what you mean. If you mean the evidences we have of the nuclear stockpile of Russia and the evidence the Russians have of our nuclear stockpile, and trying to infer what nations plan to do with these things and so on, if that's it, then I would say that is the physical fact which is leading each to increase those stockpiles and so on. Someone has estimated that the nations of the world spend $200 billion a year on armaments. And of course, it's all a total waste. 10 years from now, those planes won't fly, those men are too old, and so on and so on. They've got to keep right on another 200 billion every single year. Any organization which has that kind of waste should put a little R&D into finding out how to avoid it. Suppose we take 10% of that, 20 billion, and use that to see if we can somehow or other reduce the misunderstandings, misperceptions, if you wish to put it that way, we have of each other, and find out how we can solve these problems. I think that's quite apart from changing a way of life that I'm mentioning here.
The next point is raised by Arvid Pardo, a visiting center fellow and former ambassador from Malta to the United Nations.
I want to comment upon a sentence which Professor Skinner, I think, said this afternoon, that there is evidence that better solutions can be found to the problems of the world today. This is indeed a fact. But I would submit it has always been a fact throughout human history. Always better solutions can be found to what solutions are proposed. This is the eternal striving of man to find something better all the time. The question is whether the methods proposed by Professor Skinner, the methods envisaged, can make a contribution to this end, to this better solutions, and whether the contribution that can be made is possibly significant or not. And I would submit that certainly the contribution, I don't think, can be exclusive. In other words, these methods cannot exclude other methods. I doubt whether they can be decisive. And furthermore, with very great respect, I would say that they contain an increased possibility of reaching totally erroneous conclusions in any given situation. And this is just because of the nature of the system which is built, which is systematic, which has pretensions, serious pretensions to being valid, and which is backed by substantial research. And the advantages are reflected also in the possible disadvantages. And to back up what I say, I would like to quote a few sentences from the book. On page 147, it is stated that what needs to be changed are the contingencies if behavior is to be changed. But the problem is how to make given contingencies elicit the desired behavior from all the persons from which such behavior is desired. We have contingencies that elicit the desired behavior from a proportion, 10%, 20%, 30, 50, 80%. But the whole problem in history has been, for governments, for teachers, for religious leaders, has been to get the entire group to respond in a given way to a certain contingency. And the problem has not been solved up to now. And it appears difficult of solution except in conspicuously controlled environments. Now, in conspicuously controlled environments, you can do this, provided that the control is continuous. Secondly, provided that you control all the relevant environment. You are capable of controlling all the relevant environment. And thirdly, that the control continues unabated in the same intensity for the period of time desired to change the particular behavior. And this depends on a number of circumstances according to the behavior which you wish to change. Now, what happens in practice is that in very few circumstances can all these various factors be brought to bear on any particular type of behavior. Furthermore, the assumptions of the system can lead to possibility of very serious error. For instance, on page 156, it is said that students no longer respond in traditional ways to educational environments. Students have never responded in traditional ways to the educational environment which they're submitted. Some students did, others didn't. Perhaps the proportion now is higher than it was in the past. I have no evidence. But certainly, since formal education started, never the entire student group in any given moment responded in the desired way. Some did, some didn't. A higher proportion did, or a lower proportion did. Secondly, one assumes that they should necessarily respond to the educational environment. But the fact is that the situation now is changed. Once upon a time, you were introduced into an educational environment more or less because you wanted to be. Nowadays, you're forced to be, and you're forced to be a member of the educational community, to be a student for much longer than before. In other words, you introduce a new factor which changes the whole equation, particularly since up to 9, 10, or 11 years, you can be subject to a variety of pressures which induce you to behave well in school, but at 17 or 18, if you're forced to go to school and you don't want to go to school, you want to go to other places, well, obviously you behave badly. It's very difficult to control when you put on this additional social control on the student. But I don't want to insist on this. What I would like to strongly question is the assertion on page 158, when it is stated we must look to the contingencies that induce people to act to increase the chances that their cultures will survive. And to this, I would say, why? Why should, for instance, a Polynesian belonging to a Polynesian culture or an American Indian belonging to American Indian culture wish to see his culture survive when the surrounding conditions are such that the culture becomes obsolete? And in fact, we find that some American Indians wish their traditional culture to survive, others don't. Some feel that it has become obsolete and they should pass to another culture, others don't. In other words, the goals to which operant conditioning are applied can only be defined in terms of one's own ideas or preferences. And this becomes very serious when, for instance, one talks of the American culture, where the question immediately arises, should the American culture survive? Has it become obsolete in terms of technology? Should a new culture arise? And then you apply your goal of operant conditioning in a totally mistaken way, with the result that you don't achieve the survival of the species, you accelerate the disappearance of the species.
Let me ask you, would you regard, let us say, the home, the family, as a conspicuously controlled environment?
To some extent, yes. And
would you regard the classroom in a school?
Oh, yes.
Would you regard the incentive system in industry?
Well, yeah, not as much. There is
well, I mean, a workroom with the employees working in that room.
That would be.
Yes. Well, these are the areas in which I feel we are making very valuable contributions, and I could mention others. And if it is true, as you say, that it depends upon conspicuous control, well, then we're lucky. Now, it is not so clear how we are to handle the problems of politics, and precisely because the system is not conspicuously controlled, we'll have to do a great deal more about finding out what the variables are. In your example, your question about the proportion of students, I brought that up because at the moment in America, many people are quite disturbed by the fact that students are dropping out of school, are taking at least a year off in their college careers. They play truant much more than they used to, and so on. That is a problem now. It's a problem of a disproportionate number, which has to be solved. And my point is simply in that passage, but simply to say, don't blame the student. Look at the school situation and see why they don't actually stay in school. And as to the question of why you should care whether your culture survives, I think the point I make here is very clear on that. Students often say this to me. I was talking to a large group of students recently, and one young black student simply said, I don't give a damn whether my culture survives. And I said, precisely, that is not your fault, but your culture has lost one man. I think the honest answer to the student who says, why should I care whether my way of life survives, is simply this: there is no real reason. But if your culture hasn't convinced you there is, so much the worse for the culture. It's the culture which is going to survive. No one person is going to survive more than 100 years, with rare exceptions. It's a question of the survival of the culture. And if you seem to feel now that I am suggesting that operant principles be used to maintain a culture which has passed its prime, as the American culture may very well, that is not the case either. I want to see not the preservation of a culture as it now stands, but the gradual revision and change of that culture so that it is an effective culture.
You have been listening to one in a series of programs recorded during a conference held to discuss with Professor B.F. Skinner the theories developed in his best-selling book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. This program originated at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara.